The UK faces a winter of discontent as everything seemingly falls apart at once. More significant new promises are made in advance of the COP26 climate conference, and the US and China promise not to go into a Cold War while continuing to behave like they're in a Cold War. My name's Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. This week in the UK and Europe generally, the issue of gas prices has continued to focus the attention. The UK government has refused to help small energy companies that are currently poised on the edge, with the first few having fallen already. Indeed, the Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng said that the government should not be in the business of helping badly run companies. Which is true, but that is a bit of a slur, to be honest. I mean, some of those countries are no doubt badly run. A percentage of companies in any sector will be. And no doubt those will be amongst the first that have gone to the wall. But government decisions on core energy infrastructure have arguably exacerbated the problem with energy prices, and the government also maintains a price cap for what companies are allowed to charge customers, which is currently lower than what it costs to provide at the moment. I'm not sure how a well-managed company manages with something that costs more than they're allowed to charge for it. As it is, the government has to find a home for the customers whose energy providers go bust, which is tricky, because at a time when every customer costs you money, then you're not going to be rushing to embrace those new customers, and indeed they're not. And then suddenly we heard yesterday that ministers are backing a plan to build a new nuclear power station. The UK is in discussions with American firm Westinghouse to develop a new site in Anglesey in Wales. Good idea. Better late than never, I suppose. For the need for reliable, always-on zero-carbon power was identified by the Committee on Climate Change some years ago, and I've talked about it occasionally here. Now, even assuming that it moves forward at speed, which isn't exactly the historical norm, it won't be online before there's a particularly tight bottleneck period between 2025 and 2035. Now, in the EU, energy ministers have been discussing whether they can buy strategic gas reserves as a bloc to circumvent what they see as Russian attempts to use scarcity to drive prices up for their own benefit. Spain has been leading the push, with a confidential diplomatic paper that laid it out. Gas producers are behaving strategically to maximise their profits. We should act together to avoid being at their mercy. And the Spanish don't see it as an issue of short-term costs. The paper went on. The current crisis is a threat to carbon-cutting initiatives. Current price levels and volatility are politically unsustainable. This is not only an issue for national governments, but also for the entire European regulatory framework, which is losing credibility. And indeed, the Financial Times this week reported that surging gas and electricity prices in Europe have intensified the political backlash against Brussels' plans to extend carbon taxes on petrol and heating bills. The price squeeze has emboldened countries such as Spain and France that are firmly opposed to the planned revamp of the EU's carbon pricing system. According to Bloomberg, the Greek government have proposed that revenues from carbon permits should go to limiting the impact of spiralling energy costs on customers and on companies. It's moments like these that you find out how serious people are about what they say they want to do. You want to move to net zero? Cool. Do you still want to do it when the systems are in turmoil? And fairly or unfairly, people are blaming it on exactly that programme? Well, we will see in due course. In the UK, we have lots of people who are trying to turn the people against the idea. Some of them are actual climate skeptics, arguing that the cost of net zero is going to be too high and all of that. They are relatively marginal. Nobody's much listening to them, even when they occasionally raise a good challenge. The other people are the most extreme climate campaigners, working hard to alienate the British public and turn them off the whole idea. Now, quite some time ago, you'll remember that I predicted there would be radical offshoots from Extinction Rebellion, because if you peddle in apocalyptic messaging, and most of the activists believe their own messaging, then if the sort of actions that XR takes don't make any headway, you're naturally going to have a minority who are going to say, we need to go further and faster and more extreme. Now, my fear has always been that would be a small group that would decide violence and maybe terrorism would be the way to go. Now, that hasn't happened yet. Hopefully it won't. Instead, what we have is the offshoot that calls itself Insulate Britain, which has decided to blockade major motorways. Because nothing makes you more likely to support action on climate change than being forced by activists to sit on a stationary motorway for up to 3 hours. Even the people who generally support Extinction Rebellion's usually counterproductive actions mostly think this is dumb. It is potentially dangerous. Sooner or later there will be a serious accident. Some have suggested there's already been a semi-serious one, although I haven't seen definitive confirmation that there was cause and effect. You kind of have to beware of the people who want something to be true and spin it accordingly. But it is so obviously a hazardous thing to do. Now, the group has said that it plans to continue blocking roads every day until COP26. The police obtained an injunction against them, but only felt that they could go to an injunction that was specific to a named road. So it just covers the London Orbital Motorway, the M25. Rumours abound that it has occurred to the members of the group that they could therefore just, go and block a different road. And so it goes on. The demands of the breakaway group, which has been inspired by Extinction Rebellion co-founder Roger Hallam, are that Britain pays to insulate all of its social housing stock. Various media outlets have been making hay with the news that at least 2 of the leading figures, spokesman Liam Norton and Hallam himself, have not insulated their own homes. Which, yes, it's a demand that they've selected as an achievable goal they calculated people would generally support. It's not as though they're actually passionate for insulation, so they did it themselves or anything like that. Indeed, if you go back to the origin of Extinction Rebellion, the selection of climate change itself at that point was tactical. It's not as though they were really passionate about the issue, although of course many of those that follow them and have joined since genuinely are. Liam Norton, by the way, who for some reason keeps being offered up as a spokesman, even though he comes across on the media as something of a complete fanatic. He played to type this week by storming off a set of Good Morning Britain when he was challenged about not having insulated his own home. All of this is winning wide public support, obviously, for the serious issue of climate change. As I've said before, it's all going to get a lot louder and shriller the closer we get to the COP26 conference. It's not the only thing getting attention right now. There's also the shortage of truck drivers. Several oil companies have reported that they've had to close several sites, not because they have a shortage of fuel, just that they can't transport it to all the places it needs to go. Add to that the food retailers and many others that are warning that troubles are piling up and we could soon be having a winter of discontent, with empty shelves in the supermarkets, long queues for petrol, as well as higher energy prices, leading to all the poorest people shivering in their homes. Naturally, some in the UK have been quick to blame a lot of this on Brexit. Now, there's no doubt the increased barriers to goods travelling to and from Europe has been somewhat of an exacerbating factor, but the shortage of truck drivers seems to be pretty widespread, certainly across the continent. Britain is suffering at the moment from a 100,000 shortfall of drivers, but there's an estimated 400,000 shortfall on the continent. In the Netherlands, they're specifically recruiting and training asylum seekers to try to make up the shortfall. Germany's doing likewise, but also channeling a recruitment drive specifically towards women. I guess Angela Merkel needs a new job, so that could work. Spain has reduced the minimum age, hoping to target a rather large pool of young unemployed in the country. Poland, which is one of the largest road haulage sectors, has a 100,000 shortfall. And it's not just Europe. The US is seeing a squeeze on drivers and trouble ahead with a quarter of truck drivers due to retire before 2030. Mind you, by then, Elon Musk will probably have kitted out all the trucks with self-driving software. We may all be talking about all of those unemployed former truck drivers. But for the time being, companies like Walmart are offering large signing-on bonuses for truck drivers to try to attract them into the fold. It seems more that the interruption to the ongoing process of recruiting new drivers during the heights of the COVID lockdowns, along with a general growing dislike for the conditions of the job, have more to do with it than any isolated local factors such as Brexit. Nevertheless, it all adds to the sense of chaos and disruption, which is going to test a lot of governments over the coming months. While all this was going on at home, numerous leaders were focused on the UN General Assembly and making some rather big promises on a number of areas. And we'll come to all of that in a moment. But first, with the most extreme messages being high profile on climate change over the last couple of years, we've been seeing a rising wave of eco-anxiety amongst lots of young people. Indeed, more and more, we're hearing about young people who are taking the decision, or at least asking the question, whether to have children because of climate change. Either because they believe those children will have a terrible life on what one survey respondent called a hell planet, or they've been told that an extra child is the most carbon-intensive lifestyle choice, not my words by the way, that they could make. What's the truth behind those ideas? Obviously, it's entirely down to the individual whether they choose to have children or not. I'm not going to lecture anyone about whether they should or they shouldn't, but if people who otherwise would have opted to have kids choose not to based on those messages, is that a justified response that will turn out to be prescient and wise, or might they come to regret that decision? That's what I'm going to be looking at in the deep dive video to go live on this channel next week at Monday on 7 PM. Join me for that. Some momentum was added for the COP26 Climate Summit this week, with various contributions made of the UN General Assembly. Most unexpected was the announcement by President Xi Jinping that China would end its funding for international coal power plants. Depending on the detail of the implementation, it could pull something like $50 billion from 44 projects in Asia and Africa. According to the International Institute of Green Finance, around 70% of coal plants being built around the world are financed by China. It's not a unique move. South Korea and Japan made similar decisions earlier this year. And China's drive for foreign coal investment has been visibly diminishing already, with no new ones announced in the first half of the year. Still, it's one more nudge that has the appearance of confirming the direction of travel for coal, even as China itself remains determined to maximise the benefits to its own economy from coal in advance of its hitting its stated 2030 deadline for peak emissions. For China, it gives the impression of movement without being seen to cave into pressure on its own short-term economic interests. Speaking of those, we'll come back to them in a moment, because not everything's going swimmingly. The other significant announcement was from President Joe Biden, who announced that the US would double climate aid to support poorer nations in the energy transition and the costs of adaptation. It means that by 2025, the developed world will hit the funding target goal of $100 billion per year of climate finance. It's 5 years after it was originally supposed to, so of course those who are inclined to complain can still complain. It is a significant step nonetheless. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson also spoke to the UN General Assembly and used the whole of his speech to focus on climate change, urging the world to show that the human race could take responsibility for the consequences of its actions. Whether doing so by invoking Kermit the Frog from the Muppets was something that translated to all the nations of the world, I couldn't possibly say. Meanwhile, Boris Johnson's meetings with Joe Biden were deemed to have been a moderate success. A positive boost gained from the correlation of the visit and the announcement on climate funding, and the separate announcement that vaccinated travellers from Europe to the US would be permitted to enter again from November. There was some rather public confusion when they held the standard joint press conference afterwards. After the presentations, the British journalists asked Boris Johnson a couple of questions, which he started answering, as per every other press conference he's ever been at. But then the moment an American journalist chipped in, Biden's handlers leapt in and shooed them all out of the room, even while Boris Johnson was still talking. It just highlighted again the strategy of the Biden administration to prevent as many unscripted public exchanges as possible with the president. If a British Prime Minister was confused and baffled, it's just a reminder that it's not normal behaviour. But put that to one side, it all went according to plan. And by all account, Biden and Johnson were able to share their mutual bafflement at the extreme reaction of President Macron to the AUKUS security arrangement that continued to see language bordering on histrionics this week. France withdrew its ambassadors from the US and Australia, adding that it didn't bother to do that from the UK because basically it was already beneath contempt, and it maintained a vitriolic war of words. But some commentators pointed out that Macron had really sowed the seeds for this action with his own words and actions over recent years. So in February last year, he gave a key speech talking about defence, and it was very clear that he said he did not want to join a grand American alliance against the growing threat from China. Instead, he called for Europe to organise itself. He also said this: a situation to join all together against China, this is a scenario of the highest possible conflictuality. This one for me is counterproductive, which is pretty clear. France has long argued for a greater EU military focus, bearing in mind that France is far and away the preeminent military power left in the bloc since the UK exited. But the EU to date has made vague statements about how it thinks it should do more, which have then not been realised in terms of action. So not entirely surprising that the coalition around AUKUS formed as it did, and not wholly convincing if France's complaint is that it was left out of the partnership. Nevertheless, eventually Biden and Macron managed a phone call to discuss the conflict and achieved sufficient reconciliation for the French to permit their US ambassador to return to his post. It took a couple of days before Macron would take the president's call, because that's the level at which all this has been operating. Now, some in the country are calling for France to withdraw from NATO's command structure, as it did before under President de Gaulle in 1966, only rejoining it in 2009. Meanwhile, if President Macron was going all Napoleon Bonaparte, the leaders of the nations most on course for Cold War made a point of ratcheting down the tension in their contributions to the UN. After the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres scolded them over the weekend for the increase in confrontational language, Biden said that he had no intention of starting a new Cold War. Xi Jinping, in his pre-recorded address, said that one country's success doesn't have to mean another country's failure, and that the world was big enough to accommodate the development and progress of all countries. Which is nice. But some commentators hold that we're already in a Cold War, and it's not something that gets formally declared after all. And indeed, according to a poll this week, a majority of Europeans believe that there's an ongoing Cold War between the US and China. It's just that the majority of them don't see the conflict as having anything much to do with them. And a few conciliatory phrases at the UN doesn't suddenly make rapid military expansion and other aggressive behaviours suddenly seem normal. As if to illustrate the point, one senior diplomat with close ties to the Chinese government called upon the Chinese government, to abandon its ban on the first use of nuclear weapons. Xia Zhukang said that China's long-standing promise should be revisited. Now, it's been noted that Beijing sometimes uses academics like this to float ideas that then subsequently become policy. But then what became obvious this week is that China has significant problems of its own to contend with. The government of China has been facing a serious test on how it really deals with Chinese capitalism, as huge problems have become evident in the country's massive property market. Specifically, one of China's biggest companies, the property giant Evergrande, has borrowed heavily to finance massive expansion. How heavily? Well, it currently has debts of around $300 billion. For context, that represents about 2% of the country's entire GDP. And a payment of interest on those debts was due this week, and the expectation was that they were going to default. Over the last 25 years, the company has built millions of apartments by borrowing. But supply has exceeded demand, and large numbers of apartment blocks now stand empty or unfinished, but those debts still need to be paid. And behind all of this, there are also thousands of families that have bought homes in advance that have not even yet been finished. Now, this is a new challenge for the sort of communist China. Do they let the company fail to set an example to the rest, even though it will almost certainly cause huge ruptions? The concern is that it isn't just this one company. The entire property market in China is one big bubble. With that likely to burst and property prices likely to plummet, that could have a huge impact on local consumer confidence, economic growth. There has been more real estate defaults in China so far this year than over the last 10 years combined. And remember, China is the world's biggest consumer of raw materials, so there are all sorts of knock-on impacts to other sectors, particularly to mining groups. And it's not clear to anybody how far the contagion would spread into the West. And that was reflected in falling share prices generally earlier in the week. Now, all of this is a big deal because the presumption of many had been that the context behind that growing conflict between China and the West was an ever-burgeoning Chinese economy running rings around a stagnant and increasingly divided West. But it's easy to lose sight of the massive experiment that China is embarked upon. All previous communist authoritarian governments have failed, largely because their economies collapse. China posed a challenge because of its realization that you could keep political communism while embracing economic capitalism. But can you? Really? How long for? And how does it work exactly? A huge dilemma like this is one of the first real tests of how it's going to work. And it comes at a time when President Xi Jinping seems to be changing course on how this is allowed to work. Common prosperity has been the CCP's stated objective for decades, but with the Deng Xiaoping reforms in 1981, the party decided that common prosperity could be achieved by letting some people get rich first. You know, standard capitalism. And it did what standard capitalism does. It created wealth, led to the rise of a larger middle class. But President Xi announced just last month that common prosperity will now mean a more equal society. And we can see this in the crackdowns that I've discussed before on here on the Chinese tech giants. You could add to that crackdowns on gaming companies, Bitcoin miners, private education providers. Does this represent simply reining in the most visible inequalities to avoid endangering future support for communist rule by the masses? Or does it become a more radical revolution? In the immediate aftermath of Xi's crackdown on big corporates, around $1 trillion has been wiped off the value of Chinese assets on the open market, so that seems pretty radical already. Can the CCP harness an overheating capitalist economy and bring it to heel in a way that keeps its economic power serving the will of the state, or will it turn out to be making massive policy blunders that brings the whole house of cards tumbling down? We don't know, because it's never really been done before. Not exactly like this. Recent surveys have suggested that Chinese growth may be stalling, with manufacturing and services in contraction. This is territory the CCP hasn't had to navigate before. Traditionally, authoritarian governments get into trouble eventually. Can China really defy that rule for an extended period into the future? Having created that sizable middle class, what happens if its newly revived communist instincts begin to bash into that group's expectations of the quality of their lives going forward? Every month I try to do one discussion video where I look at some of the issues that I've covered before, see who's saying what about them, what updates there have been, and all of that. And there's lots to talk about right now, with all sorts of updates on the lab leak hypothesis, on climate and other science fact checkers, and challenges to their integrity, on ivermectin, and a whole lot more. So I'll be covering all of that in the video to go live on Wednesday next week at 7 PM UK time. Join me for that. I ran out of time for a final short thought of the week, and the space has been filled with news in any case. I'm not sure if people value the short thought slots that I've been doing, or whether you'd rather I just filled it all up with news. Maybe let me know about that in the comments below. Last week I mentioned that a bunch of my older videos I'd noticed had been quietly demonetised sometime after the event, specifically videos on the lab leak hypothesis and on ivermectin. As I said I was going to, I duly appealed on each of those, and they were all restored once they got looked at by a human being. So I now have to add a to-do list item for every week just to go back and check, see if YouTube has been retrospectively raiding the back catalogue. And it's another reminder, again, of the attempt to talk independently about the issues of the moment, even when you're committed to staying close to the evidence and avoiding all the conspiracy stuff. It's been made more difficult by YouTube. You're constantly left wondering what's going to get you into trouble and what you're allowed to say, which is why lots of people self-censor. For example, some of those creators who now actually make a show of not using the word ivermectin because they don't know if even just saying the word might be enough to get them banned. I mean, it isn't, as we've shown here. It does depend what you say about it, but it can get a video demonetized through the time when it would normally get its biggest audience. Now, I won't self-censor, and that's made possible, as you know, because of the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Without that support, I couldn't spend the time making content as I do. I would have to make more of the easy content, likely to get a wider audience, and less of the content that YouTube will demonetize and not promote to wider audiences. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. And if you can't support in that way, and I know lots of people can't right now, tough times, then please consider at least supporting by sharing this video on social media. Or if you have a favourite podcast or creator who does interviews with people in this sort of sector on these sorts of issues, suggest they add me to their list of people that they should interview sometime in the future. Generally, let's help to spread the word and see if we can break out of the YouTube slow lane that the channel has been put into since early March. In any case, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.